this assisted dying bill, even knowing and having seen other people suffer and eventually die from illnesses. There's so many reasons I would never support this new bill that has been preliminarily voted on. It hasn't become law yet in the United Kingdom,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, I wasn't sure what the status of the bill was, so maybe you can talk to us a little bit about
yeah,
that.
I don't know the British process that well, but it was voted on in the House of Commons, so in like the Congress. But then
Hmm.
it goes to the House of Lords, I think, and then it has to. There's a couple more steps before it actually becomes law, but it passed with a majority of, if memory serves, 35 MPs. 35 MPs voted for it than against it. So it's kind of a done deal. I don't think there's. I don't know what the odds are of it being stopped or they're saying they still can add more safeguards and guardrails to the law as it exists. Um, so that maybe might come to pass and might make it slightly better. But I don't think I would support any kind of assisted dying bill at this point, having lived through COVID, having lived through and seen from afar, not lived through personally, but seen what's happened in Canada, and even more foundationally, having seen what happened to the pro-choice movement, which it's you think it's very humane. Yes, absolutely, my body, my choice, and then you find out that there's like multiple states in the United States where you can get an abortion at any time for any reason up to point of birth,
Hmm.
and you think, well, actually, no, that's not humane at all. Like, so this whole sort of life and dignity and rights and respect thing to me is completely upended, and now I see it entirely in line with the Christian view, whereas before I would have been more in the sort of materialist world. But in the UK in
How would
particular,
you, if you were going to state the Christian view of that sort of in a nutshell, how would you state that?
well, in terms of euthanasia, it's not for
Yeah.
a doctor or even a person to decide. I mean, the thing is, the reason that was always hard for me to accept was if a person has a terminal diagnosis, they should be able to, if they choose, get a speedier death that will skip over the horrors of certain cancers or certain kind of motor neuron diseases or whatever, the absolute collapse of all bodily function. And that still seems to be like a reasonable position. My problem is, in practice, you can never seem to have one without the other. If you accept that part, then you also it turns out get the, oh, you're unemployed and depressed, maybe you should kill yourself when you go to the
Hmm.
doctor, which is
Oh,
what I
right.
Yeah. Hmm.
understand to be the
Hmm.
Hmm.
case in Canada. And Melanie, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, first of all, hello everybody. It is Monday, December 2nd, and we are live on YouTube and Twitter. And my name is Leslie Elliott Boyce. I'm joined by Jennifer Friend, Jenny Holland, Christine Sefein-Wolk, and Melanie Bennet. Today we're missing Deborah, so hi Deborah. We'll see you next week. And the topic is euthanasia, assisted dying, medical homicide, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of euphemisms for this, but basically allowing the state to make decisions about when to approve someone's death and help them to die. And it's pretty heated. There's been a bill just debated and, as Jenny was telling us, approved in the House of Commons in the UK that is pro assisted death, state death, basically. And Melanie is in Canada and has been living under a MAID system for a couple of, what is it, a couple years now? A year? How long has MAID been around, Melanie?
Nearly 10 years.
Oh my gosh,
Ooh.
really?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So the UK, and so I was following this a little bit in the UK, and I was shocked that it was passed. The UK and Canada actually have a fairly similar system politically. And it seems to me that the assisted dying bill is also going through the human rights pathway. And so that's where we're coming from here in Canada. And this is why people talk about the slippery slope fallacy when it comes to assisted dying. And this is kind of what's happening in Canada now, is that it started off in the way that it's being proposed in the UK. So I listened to the House of Lords debate on this, and it was very much, there are all these safeguards. We're making sure this is adults. They are terminal. It's not going to affect young people. It's not for mental illness. It's not for all these other things, but it's still going through the human rights pathway. But in Canada, that's what happened. That's what we did. It was supposed to be for people who were terminally dying, that these very few cases, they had no hope of recovering. It's really just a compassionate move. And then over time, because it's going through the human rights in Canada here, it is expanded for other illnesses. So it's not just terminal, it's where you have no hope of recovery. And so that went to those who may have disabilities, right? And you have to show that there's no going back for whatever reason. And they're moving towards including mental health, but it's not passed yet. So that could happen in 2027, I believe it is. And the trouble that I have, especially after my own research over the past few years in education, is this human rights element. Because if one person has the so-called right to request their own death, then because it's under human rights and everybody's supposed to have equal human rights, this is the slippery slope. So it just gets expanded, because you can't really justify, well, if they have the right, why can't I have the right? And so that's the concern that I have in the UK. And I do see many intelligent people have pointed this out about Canada. I think the first year for MAID, there was about 1,000 assisted dying, I suppose you'd call them MAID deaths, which I looked it up before coming. And I think in 2021, which is still 3 years ago, that had increased tenfold to over 10,000. And currently, as of last year, Canada has the highest rate of organ harvesting from assisted suicide deaths. And so we have a problem here that we're not talking about, and that's incentives and what the human rights pathway is putting into this, or injecting into this situation, right? So I think Canada is a really important important country to be looking at in terms of the potential consequences of these sorts of measures, right? Even if it starts off in a place that is compassionate and for a very few select people who may be in a lot of anguish at the end of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, those numbers are staggering. I mean, so the UK obviously has yet to actually adopt this new proposed law, and it has those. So the UK law now is couched as only for people with a diagnosis of having 6 months to live, which to me is odd, because it's like, well, if you have that diagnosis, you don't need assisted dying. You have 6 months to live. I find that to be a little bit redundant in a way, but that's not even the most concerning thing to me. The most concerning thing to me is that in the UK, we basically have like a broken public health service. And, it was once the sort of pride and joy of the United Kingdom. And it's often described as like a religious institution, the level that the people are devoted to the NHS here. And it used to be really a great service, but it's really struggling now. And I think it's the biggest item in the United Kingdom's budget, if I'm not mistaken, runs in the billions of pounds, I would imagine. And just as like a few very small examples that don't pertain to anything like this severe, but like for if you have a child who needs a diagnosis of ADHD or a learning disability that would then help the child get a classroom assistant state-funded place, the waiting list where I live now is 4 years.
Wow.
4 years to wait. About 11 or 12 years ago, I unfortunately had a miscarriage when I was living in London. And I went into the hospital, and it was in central London, one of the most beautiful hospitals I've ever seen, like this gleaming modern tower. And I was admitted to the hospital, and they couldn't treat me because they only had one functioning operating room, and some young man had come in having had a motorcycle accident. So they just kept me in the hospital and I didn't really need to be there, and they couldn't treat me. They couldn't do anything. And it just seemed like the resources were just like really kind of like, I'm like, how is this? I'm in the most fancy hospital I've ever seen in my life, and you can't treat this simple this simple problem.
Mhm.
So the incentive, obviously, I mean, to me, it just seems like such a huge conflict of interest to give that same organization that's currently struggling to meet its basic duty of care and say, oh, you know what you guys can do? You guys can now propose this and facilitate this, which is the death of your patient, thus moving them off of your balance sheet, essentially. And that to me is really alarming and horrifying. Like, you can't meet your basic care needs of your population, but you are going to be able to assist in their death actively.
Yeah,
Like,
that's kind of what's happening in Canada. My understanding is that medical doctors or nurses, they're not allowed to offer MAID. Like that is out of the bounds of the ethics. It's supposed to be requested by the patient. But more and more stories are coming out of what's the meme? Like you go into the doctor and say, my knee hurts. And they say, have you considered MAID? Like these
Mhm.
stories are coming out, right? And it's not officially allowed. And yet that happens because you're correct. That's the issue. That's the slippery slope. It's the
yeah,
incentive because our healthcare system is a universal system and it's struggling under the pressure, just like the UK is struggling under the pressure. And you have a system where people can get made within days, be scheduled
Oh,
for their
wow.
final termination
Wow.
within days after they've been
God.
interviewed and assessed and so on and so forth. And so if you've been like, imagine if you are not terminal, but you have a disability and it is maybe you have fibromyalgia, it's unexplained, you're going through a lot of pain for many, many years. You're living off no money because you can't work. You're depressed because nobody's coming to hang out with you, or you have social
Mhm.
issues, you have poverty issues. Well, you go for the assessment, you say, well, I'm living with this debilitating pain and I need to go. Well, we're not providing those individuals with services that would actually alleviate some of the
Exactly.
mental health stress and
Right.
more uh, thorough and holistic treatments, right? We're just going, oh, okay, you want MAID, no worries, and that's done within days, weeks. So there are incentives, and
Yeah.
that's where I have an issue with it too. It's not. Oh, there's so much sunshine. It's not necessarily the compassionate care for those dying, but then there's also. I just want to raise another thing to think about is the Hippocratic Oath. As far as I know, and I'm no expert, but as far as I know, part of the Hippocratic Oath is that doctors are not meant to administer poisons. They're not meant to
That's the
administer.
original Hippocratic
Yeah,
Oath.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they've changed that, haven't they?
that's a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the original one said
Harm.
and I just read this the other day on a show with Benjamin, but it specifically says I will not. Here, I can pull it up. Yeah, this is the old one.
They're not supposed to cause the death of a patient,
Nor
and
shall
this is
any
directly causing
man's
the death of a patient.
Yeah, exactly. Nor shall any man's entreaty prevail upon me to administer poison to anyone. Neither will I counsel any man to do so. Moreover, I will give no sort of medicine to any pregnant woman with a view to destroy the child. So the original
Yeah,
Hippocratic Oath forbade
Mm.
killing
Abortion.
and abortion. Yeah, abortion, killing
Yeah.
the unborn, but also killing living people.
I think the to go back to what Jen asked me before, and that's a good segue, Leslie. I think if you steel man this argument that everyone has the right to decide this and that suffering should be spared, that's the compassionate element of this, right? Okay, you shouldn't have to go through the horrors of this process of having your body break down in painful and messy ways. um, but I think the Christian side of that, well, and let's not call it Christian because I'm not going to speak for Christians. I am not a Christian. But what I think the sort of more religious spiritual element that has the issue with that is that, first of all, this idea that suffering must be avoided at all costs. Suffering is completely not, we can't have suffering.
Hmm.
Um,
Mm.
as if that's not part and parcel of life. And because
Mm-hmm.
also suffering cannot be overcome and cannot be managed within the human spirit. So you can't, if you have this a certain diagnosis, there's nothing you can do. It's it's beyond redemption. It's beyond help. It's beyond any kind of salve. There's nothing that will soothe you and help you. Just give up. Just give up. Literally. So I actually, I mean, every time I see these, because I follow people from Canada on X, and I see a lot of these encounters where people are like, I went with back problems and they told me to kill myself. And I find them genuinely, it's like a black comedy. It's like, this is the most grotesque thing I've ever heard. Um, but that's the thing. It's like, there's no point. Just forget about it. Give up. Essentially, you have no value, and just move on down the conveyor belt and make space for someone else. And, so no matter how many times people are going to say no, it's about compassion. And my father died of cancer. Actually, it was quite a fast and comparatively painless. But I've heard terrible things, people having stomach cancer, and
Oh yeah.
I've seen people in terrible, terrible suffering, ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer. I mean, I understand the horrors that await people in these situations, and God bless them. Like, I've seen it with my own eyes. It's terrible. But this idea that, okay, well, let's just like scratch that off. And then it becomes a bureaucratic issue. Like, where is the care? Where is the humanity? Where is the palliative care? All of those things are completely possible. It's not like it's beyond the realm of possibility. Like, it's not like nobody knows how to make a dying person feel comfort and a dying person's family feel comfort. It's just that we can't be bothered. The medical establishment cannot be bothered. And in my personal
Mm.
doctors, they're extremely callow. They're extremely brusque. They do. I mean, it's not something that they excel at. They feel, they seem irritated by the emotional component of being told terrible news, and
Hmm.
they're like, "What? Okay, all right, well, bye," and then they like run off to their next patient. I get it. It's a very busy job, very tough job, but like that idea that, well, suffering, we can just like blot it out. We can just hit delete.
There's
We
also
can't.
like a question of responsibility too. Like, is in the original Hippocratic Oath, it seems to be taking the perspective that here you're a trained physician, you're a trained medicine person, and here are the limits to how you can use here are the ethical limits to how you can use your training. And the modern medical profession is saying, if we can't help you by making you better, then somehow you're still our responsibility. And so we're going to take responsibility for ending your, it's not like a limit, like saying, okay, well, we couldn't help you, I'm so sorry. Respect for life, respect for things that are outside of our control. We have to ultimately control this. And so we still have other things we can offer you, even just death. And we've got, what I wonder is, like, we have such weird social scripts around suicide right now. Like, you see suicide used as this political cudgel by the trans activist groups, for one thing, like this group of people who's, if you don't help them, they'll kill themselves. So you must
Yes.
help them. You must do these things, even these like really
It's
radical
weaponized.
body modifications and life changing hormonal therapeutics that will sacrifice the long-term health of the physical body because the threat of suicide is there. Oh my God, they might feel bad enough that they kill themselves. And then you also have, like, even right now, I'm aware that we're limiting the reach of this video, because if you say words like suicide or kill yourself, you say these words, you will have it possibly demonetized, definitely not promoted by the algorithm the way that these videos normally would be promoted. People have all these fancy ways of saying unalived and KYS and these sorts of euphemistic things that they do to trick the algorithm into still promoting their content if they use these words, because they're such hot potatoes. And then you have the way that people are treated if they express suicidal ideation. Like, people, I've heard people who won't see therapists because they have such a problem with the fact that here's this person who's supposed to help you with your mental health, and if you express deep, deep feelings of distress, which often come along with suicidal ideation for people. If you express that to the therapist, the state gets brought in. They have to report it. They're mandatory reporters, which, if you're a good therapist, that's not going to be an automatic thing that you do, but it's right there in your limits of confidentiality statement that you have to give your clients. Like if you're a threat to yourself or others, blah, blah, blah. So it's there's this threat hanging over you if you think about suicide. And yet, if you want to do it, as long as the government approves, here we have a man who can come in and help you right now. But don't you dare do it yourself or think about doing it yourself. Don't you do that. Here we have our doctor standing by. You're really depressed and you have an eating disorder and you don't see any hope of getting better. Well, here's a man.
Yeah, I feel like that's part of the ethical issue that I don't hear enough about, which is completely disregarded, which I think is actually Christian. So I'm also not a Christian, but I've been spending a lot of time talking to Christians recently. The idea that there's things beyond us that man should not be in control of or making decisions about because that leads to bad outcomes. And this is one of those, well, man's deciding when it's okay to snuff out the life of someone else and when it's not okay, right? And we have an issue with the death penalty for murder. I know that there's a death penalty in America, but certainly in Canada, this is highly contentious. People really hate it. They think it's awful. Same thing in the UK, very, very much against it. But somehow in this circumstance, because this group of people have decided that they did the checks and their politicians and their doctors and experts in this area, that they somehow know when it's the correct time to be able to kill someone. But under no other circumstances, like you say, Leslie, right? This idea that man has the capacity to decide when to do this and when not to do this. And I don't think that's being explored enough. I think all these countries taking on assisted suicide, I think down the line there's going to be a lot of regrets. I really do, because what we're doing is we're opening a door for a lot of unintended consequences along the lines of even eugenics, right? When we talk about getting rid of the disabled, when we talk about getting rid of the people with mental health issues, well, if you're not, have you thought about MAID? You've had depression all this time, it's not working, why don't you consider MAID? Like those situations, how is this not any different from programs to euthanize the so-called weak in a society?
Yeah, exactly. And it also sorry, Jen, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, I have a question I want to pose to the group, which might be sort of a clumsy question, but so we're all familiar with if an elderly dog is very ill and suffering, most people would say it is cruel to keep this dog alive, and you would look askance at an owner that would prolong that dog's suffering. Given how much more complex humans are, is it possible that the same applies to us in our suffering, but maybe even more so? Like, is it possible that it's cruel to keep a suffering human alive? And I don't mean suffering as in I've slipped a disc in my back and the surgery didn't quite work. I'm talking about people, I worked in a nursing home and I saw people just lying in agonizing pain, even on medicine. Sometimes a person's opioid receptors have been destroyed. Is there some cruelty to it? Setting aside when this MAID stuff becomes misused and abused, is it cruel to keep people alive who are in absolute agony, who stand no chance of improvement?
Yeah, it seems to be a question between whether or not we feel that man should be able to make the decisions about man. Because when we're talking about a dog, it's not human. So that would be the spiritual case of that is not a human. It's different when it comes to humans. So we can talk about euthanizing animals all we like, a completely different issue. But when it comes to other human beings, that's the spiritual element in there that I'm sort of turning to now to seeing this, because I used to be in favor of MAID when it came out. Like I thought this was a great idea because of the suffering of those individuals. But seeing how this has developed over time, now I'm understanding that there's an awful lot of consequences when we start seeing man being in charge of the unknown, uncontrollable elements about man, right? Is that in the hands of a so-called higher power? Whether you're spiritual or not, you can call it God, you can call it just that we're maybe not responsible enough to make those management decisions about men, because we've had periods of history with awful things have happened when people take into their own control the life and death of other citizens in this way, right?
Yeah.
So that's the ethical question here, is like, it could be, if you take the view that this is really up to a higher power, something that is bigger than man and not within our control, that some people are going to suffer, because that's an unfortunate circumstance, but that's also a part of death. Like, that is the process of death, as unfortunate as it is. You could see it that way, or you could see it along the ways. Do we trust humans to be able to make the right decisions, and that it won't go skew-whiff, it won't go in the wrong directions? We're not going to end up having mass euthanasia programs once you reach a certain age, or a doctor has decided for you that, oh, well, you have had depression for the last 2 years. I think it's time for you to go on MAID now. You know?
I mean, I think, my father's quite ill at the moment himself. He's got Alzheimer's, and that's just going to go downhill from here. We were literally just talking about that before we went live. And so we know what we're going to see, and we know what to expect. We're keeping him as comfortable and as, healthy as we possibly can by being around people, by, he's in a living community with people that also have similar issues, but he's not so sick yet that he doesn't know who we are. So we're trying to make the most of this time, but we know where this train is going to end. And he has a do not resuscitate, and we've all signed that, signed as power of attorney that that's what we would do. So for me, I'm thinking, well, how does that do not resuscitate kind of factor in to all of this, that I don't want life-saving procedures done if I were to have a massive heart attack or a massive stroke and I'm on machines? Then it's up to us as his kids. I mean, the power of attorney is shared between my sister and I. So it's up to us to make the decision, but he's made the decision when he was still alive and well. So we feel compelled to follow through with that. So where does that become, was it really his decision? Because at that point, he's not going to be in his right mind, probably. He was when he made the decision to do it, though. So I think there's that component of having these advanced directives and do not resuscitate. And if something happens to me, and so I have a do not resuscitate and I have an advanced directive, even at my age, anything can happen. I've had multiple surgeries. And the question is, well, if something happens to you in surgery, do you want us to try to bring you back? My answer has been no. If I cannot breathe on my own, eat on my own, and in some way, not even paralyzed, I, didn't even go there, but I definitely wanted to be able to take care of basic things on my own. If that's not going to be the case, I want to be let go. So in that, scenario, that's my decision. My husband doesn't necessarily agree with this, but this is something that I've actually decided to do. So those questions kind of start running through my mind too when we're talking about all of this. Where does that fit in?
Well, I'm thinking about Jennifer's question about pets. I have always sat uneasily with pet ownership for a number of reasons. And I've had pets throughout my life. My husband has a couple cats, so I'm now a cat owner. I have chickens. I have the idea of a companion animal has always, this is like a different topic. Like we could have a whole long conversation just about that. I've been uncomfortable with it because it requires such a high degree of control over the life of another being, from controlling their sexual maturation and their affiliation with others of their own kind to, all these things that, and it's very, I know that that's a weird thing to raise because pet ownership is really normal in Western culture. It's really normal to have a dog or a cat, and a lot of people do. So my thoughts on this might be a little bit of an outlier. But when you talk about the decision at the end of your pet's life or during a time of great suffering and illness for your pet to, as we say, put them to sleep, another euphemism, to kill them, to kill the pet, to end their life, to cause death. I feel really uneasy about that. And I have done that before also. I mean, we had a family cat that when I was a kid drank antifreeze. And so this cat was suffering horribly. And we took the cat in and administered a lethal injection. So the cat died peacefully. But the word, when we're thinking about humans, to say, keep them alive, again, that comes back to like the idea of responsibility. Like, we're keeping them alive. are we taking responsibility for their life by putting in like a feeding tube or keeping them hydrated or in some way actually prolonging the physical life of a body of a person who is really, really suffering? If a person is no longer able to eat and drink on their own, is there a time when we say maybe just provide them with palliative care, keep them as comfortable as possible, and sit with them as they ride their last moments out? Maybe is there some difference maybe in choosing to kill them proactively versus allowing them to die?
So
Yeah.
you're in America, and here in Canada, we have universal health care. Same in the UK. The problem with that is that there's no money. Keeping it on life support requires an awful lot of resources, and nobody wants to privatize. And so you have a situation here where you can either offer substandard palliative care if they have access to it, because you're not allowed to access private healthcare. You can in the UK, but not here in Canada. And so there's no funding for these services. We have no doctors. People have long waiting lists. The services just aren't there. Or you could choose MAID.
Wait, you
Right?
can't get
So
healthcare?
you're not allowed. No. So in the UK, you can choose like Bupa and things like that. You can choose private healthcare, but you're not allowed here. So people, even if you could afford
Wow.
it, you either go to the USA to get your care, or you wait for care if you get care here. So if you're facing like palliative care, sure, it might exist, but it might be severely underfunded if you have access to it. It might be great, who knows, depending on where you live. But there's some serious questions around people accessing things like MAID simply because they're not we have nothing to offer, or very poor services to offer people to help them live a good death, if that makes sense, right? Live a good end of life.
Yeah.
And so the easier solution, well, then we go, oh, it's just compassionate allowing them to die because they're suffering. But have we caused that suffering because we're not allowing a system to actually provide for them? So this is a reality in a country with a universal healthcare like the UK or Canada that possibly isn't the same in the US.
Wow, that's incredible about Canada. I don't know. I mean, I think there's definitely a clear difference between actively having a doctor kill you, like literally just be like, here you go. This is, and I don't know if they give it to you by injection. I don't know how it's actually administered, injection or pills, but it's like they're writing you a prescription that will result in your death immediately, and sort of stopping care,
Well,
letting nature take its course. It seems to me. I mean, to me, the really hard stuff is the Alzheimer's type scenarios. People who are very old, like you were mentioning, Jen, and that it does only go in one direction. But it's like, no matter what that entails, and the toll it takes, even more on the family than it does on the person. But it's like the state cannot and it should never have the ability to write a prescription to end that person's life. It cannot be
I
done.
had I had a client once in California. You need two doctors to say that you're terminal. So they both need to agree. And then it's a series of pills. It's not actually the most pleasant way to go. I had a client whose sister chose to end her life, and she was terminal with throat cancer. It was a really nasty disease. And she had to take about 90 pills over the course of 12 to 18 hours. I forgot which it was. So there was no such thing as you just get an injection and your life is over, or they give you enough morphine to put you to sleep to where your organs just, fail and you die. You actually had, and the reasoning behind that was that they wanted her to be in as clear of, mind as possible, that she could actually physically administer the medication herself. She couldn't have any help from the doctors or from the sister. So the doctors assisted in writing the prescription, but we're talking about 90 something pills, each one meant to slow down and then eventually stop the functioning of each organ. This was not a humane, and in my opinion, that did not seem like a very humane, compassionate way to end somebody's suffering. I mean, this woman was very distressed and traumatized by watching her sister have every organ shut down one at a time. That's the California law. And that's what it was 10 years ago when I had this client. I don't know what it looks like today, but that is kind of how they went around all of that and made it so that it seemed to be the patient's decision. But at the same time, I wouldn't consider it a very humane way, not with what she described that she saw at each stage of taking these medications.
Wow.
I'll spare the details for you all here, but it wasn't pleasant.
I would agree that's horribly inhumane. I think it's Sweden, you can meet a doctor in a hotel room. The doctor gives you one pill. Then the doctor leaves. You take the pill. You are dead an hour later. And
Yeah.
people are now going to Sweden to get this pill.
Yes.
It's called death tourism.
Yes, I've heard of that.
So I actually do believe in medically assisted death in very specific limited conditions. But I share everybody's concerns that have been expressed here, because I do think that slippery slope arguments are very often true. And we've already seen that they're using this inappropriately. And I think the government uses it to its own convenience to eliminate people that aren't that they are unable to serve, or don't wish to serve, or don't have the
Or too
funding to
costly for
serve.
the
So
health service.
I think there's huge problems and dangers with it that really frighten me. But I also think that any solution breeds new problems. So I don't want to do away with it. I'd like to fix it. But speaking for myself personally, if I had some absolutely horrible, agonizing disease, I'd go to Sweden. I would. And I think, in terms of like, oh, well, we're interfering with God, blah, blah, blah. Well, we're already doing that anyhow and I know it's to prolong life, but all of the stuff that we do is so unnatural anyhow, keeping people alive on machines sometimes.
Have you ever
I don't
heard
know.
of
I don't find the God argument terribly persuasive in the face of agonizing human suffering, but that's just me.
I
So
heard a statistic in this this debate as the UK was about to have to hear this bill, that about 40% of cases are non-consensual for assisted dying. It's about 40% of the cases, the person is either declared incompetent or the decision is made some other way. And one of the cases, I talked to this man named Alex Shadenberg back in September, and I recorded that conversation for this channel. So if people are interested in hearing more about it, they can go and listen to that. He was really interesting. He's from the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and he's Canadian. And he has a lot of statistics and a lot of information about how assisted suicide and euthanasia programs play out. And he answers a lot of those things, like what you're talking about, Jennifer. I think the reason why this is so compelling is that there's something understandable in it for all of us. Like, we can all imagine a circumstance where somebody's life is lingering on despite absolute agony or hopelessness or something like this, where our compassionate heart goes out to that. And we can imagine that if it were us or a loved one, we'd want to have some way to it's kind of like the the classic the tropes in Westerns where the horse is shot and just dying on the ground, but he's still alive. And so the cowboy shoots him and puts him out of his misery. So
right.
we all have some kind of scenario we can dream up, and we can say, yeah, well, I think that we should have access to that as a resource. But I think the way that it plays out is very different. And one of the cases that Alex told me about was the Dutch coffee case. Do you guys know about this? Have you heard this story?
No, what's that?
Okay, so this lady, she died in 2016. She was killed through assisted suicide or euthanasia. I guess they're different things. Euthanasia is mercy killing. Assisted suicide is I kill myself and you help me. So this lady, she was 74 when she died. 4 years prior to her death, she said, if I get to the point where I have to go into a care home, I want to be euthanized first. So then she got a couple years later, she's an Alzheimer's patient. She got to the point where her care team and her family decided she needed more care. She was needing a higher level of care, so it's time to go into a care home. So the doctor, looking at her previous statement, said, okay, well, we're not going to put her in a care home. We're going to end her life. She said, no, I take it. I don't want to do that anymore. I was wrong. I want to live. I don't want to do that. Her family and the doctor slipped a sedative into her coffee to get her to sleep so that they could administer the lethal medication.
Oh my God.
She woke up
Wow.
anyway, and they ended up fighting her and wrestling her to get
Oh
this
my
medication
God.
administered to kill this woman.
Wow.
And the doctor was exonerated. There was a charge against the doctor, and it was determined that the doctor didn't do anything wrong. And so this is just like this woman on the strength of her prior statement, they decided it was time to kill her. When she said, no, I changed my mind, they said, you're not competent to make that decision. You were competent then. And so we're going to base our decision on your prior statement, not this current non-competent statement.
Yeah, oh my
That's,
God.
yeah, that's fascinating. That's just, that's exactly one of the type of scenarios that I would be worried about.
So this is why
Yeah,
I bring up
that's really
God, and
scary.
it's not God per se, because I'm not a Christian. I don't even believe in God. But to a Christian or to many religious people, they'd call it God. It's just there are things that humans potentially should not be in control of, because that should be up to whatever higher power, because man is not responsible enough to control things like the death of other men, right? So that's one of the arguments, and it's not so much the flying man in the sky God, but because of situations like this, and because over time, if you then start looking at the death of other people differently, and so you widen what's acceptable in terms of, well, it's just come to that point and your family has decided that it's time for you to go now, right? So there's all of these slippery slope arguments become, I'm not a big slippery slope person, but when it comes to assisted dying, I just see this happening in country after country after country who've
Yeah.
adopted it.
It's true.
I think what the religious framework does, which is what is lacking here, and it's leading us into horrors, is the religious framework gives a very hard line. Thou shalt not kill. Okay, and war is accepting, like that applies to everyone in every case, no exceptions, and the reason the no exceptions are there are because, as you were just saying, Melanie, man lacks the wisdom and the responsibility to really be truly judicious in deciding who gets the exception. And that puts an enormous burden back on us as mere mortals, whether it's in dealing with unwanted pregnancies or dealing with elderly people who can't take care of themselves. Then that puts the burden back on us. Well, no, we are responsible. We, the collective, the family, the community, are responsible for caring for these vulnerable people. And that's really effing hard. Okay. That's hard. That is, I'm not trying to say, oh yeah, we should all be able, no problem. Like, no, I mean, that's a hard thing to do. Like never mind the fact that society is not set up for this. And I'm not sure if it ever was, but it's draining, it's a sacrifice, it's annoying, it's all these things that taking care of very unwell or very vulnerable or helpless people is, I mean, it's a vocation. It's a gift from God if you have that type of patience and you have that type of compassion and that type of strong stomach that you can do that all the time. Like, God bless you, you're an angel. I certainly don't have it. But that's the entire point. That's the religious framework, is that we are not gifted with enough real compassion and enough wisdom to decide who lives and dies. So we have to let nature take its course in every instance. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with that wholeheartedly. I struggle with that. I don't agree with it wholeheartedly, really. But I certainly agree wholeheartedly that the state is not capable of decision, especially since we've lived through vaccine mandates, mask
Yes.
mandate, shut down your business, stay
Yes.
2 feet away from people or 2 meters away from people or whatever nonsense. I mean, and the people who are making those decisions have shown themselves to be not only, maybe just outwardly bad people, but incredibly fucking dumb. Okay. These people are dumb,
Incompetent. Yes, they're incompetent.
competent. They are not to be trusted to run a bake sale, much less decide who lives and dies. Like, that is absolutely the bottom line.
Yeah,
And yet those are the
I
people
share your
making the
I
decisions.
do share your distrust of the state. I
Yeah,
fully get where you're coming
absolutely.
from on that.
It's like one of the comments that came in and said it's the doctors that decided, not the state. Whether or not you believe that that should have been the case for this particular woman, at least in my example, it wasn't the state that had the answer. The state has no law for that. It's just not. It's considered not illegal. I guess that's the best way to put it. So it's decriminalized, but it's not regulated really, other than the doctors themselves.
I don't trust
This
the
is, no,
doctor
but
to make.
that's not true. Because this is where the state comes in. And so, yes, it's the doctors making those decisions. But when there are clear breaches of those ethics, like in the coffee case, isn't it funny that the state did decide that that doctor did nothing wrong? Because to admit that the doctor did wrong means that you would have to reevaluate the entire system. And that's actually a
Sure.
benefit to the healthcare system, which is also universal in the Netherlands. So there's a lot of political implications in that. And even though the doctor, so we see this with COVID, is that technically doctors were making decisions to a certain extent, but then when the state gets involved, it has to protect a decision that's actually beneficial to the state. And so the state is always involved in one way or another, right? Like
When
it's going to
you're a
protect
doctor,
Well, the
you have to.
doctors were also working. I mean, if we look at Anthony Fauci, who was his boss? His boss was the government. He was working for the
and
government.
whenever you hear doctor,
he wasn't his own.
You have to think government, because that's who's licensing that doctor. That's their license is granted through their government.
They're literally arms of the state. They are arms of the state. And, I mean, they make mistakes. They make mistakes all the time.
Sure.
I know someone who was told in her second trimester that her baby had a terrible, like probably fatal abnormality and she should absolutely abort. They weren't 100% sure, but they were pretty sure. And they really put the screws on her to have a late term abortion. And she's like, oh, I just couldn't do it. And she's now got like a 16-year-old kid who's perfectly fine. Okay. They make mistakes all the time. The doctors are the ones going around telling kids, oh yeah, take puberty blockers. Oh yeah, chop off your tits. Don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. Okay.
Yeah.
These things turned out to be true.
Yeah, and I'm not defending all of that either. I'm not trying to say that the doctors are not to blame as well. So maybe I should correct what I was trying to get at. But my point is, yes, I do believe that the state should not be involved in those decisions at all. I don't think that they have they don't have the education. They don't have the well-being in mind. Obviously, it's part of a bigger machine. And I get that. I was completely against vaccines and the mandates and all of that. And I knew that they were trying to control us. I didn't, crawl out from underneath a hole or a rock. I'm completely aware of that. But I guess my point is that, when I would probably, Jenny and Jennifer, when you said earlier that if it were you that were in a very terminal situation, you would go off to Sweden probably and do that. I probably would too. I would actually, that's something, because I wouldn't want to have my family and the people around me also have to care for me in that kind of regard. So I'm not 100% opposed. I'm opposed to the government being very involved. And I'm opposed to the fact that you've got depression, you've got, suicidal ideation. Great. Let's just get rid of you. I'm opposed to the fact that they don't want to provide care and they don't want to provide, extra assistance. So that's the easy way out. I'm opposed to that completely. It's not our place to say 100%. That. At the same time, if it were me in a certain scenario, which I'm not, but if I was, I'm saying that now. I don't know. If somebody told me I was terminally ill tomorrow, maybe I would change my mind. I don't know that. Right now, it's about what I picture and imagine. Right now, it's about what am I going to do for my father who has a DNR and doesn't want to be resuscitated if something were to happen to him. Right now, I'm caring for somebody and want to give him the best life possible. And I don't want the state involved or anybody telling us what to do with him, because we are the ones that are taking, control of caring for this man and making sure we can give him a good life. That's all. That's what's happening now in my world. That could change. I could change my mind. But as of now, that's where I'm at. And that's kind of how I see all this. We don't by any means want to put my father in a home. My sister and I have talked about multiple ways to prevent that from happening, to give him a good life. Can somebody with Alzheimer's have a good life? Yes, they can. It depends on the degree of the Alzheimer's, but there are still things that they do that they can enjoy. And I've seen my father have moments of joy that he didn't have years ago when he was healthy. So I don't believe that everybody who ends up with Alzheimer's is also going to be such a burden that we need to get rid of them. So I just want to be really clear about kind of where my stance is on all that.
I have two thoughts. One is, Jenny, when you're talking about the state and death, administering death, one of the things, I've always been against the death penalty, not because we don't have people who commit crimes for which they deserve death and for which it makes sense and it's just that they die, but because our administrative system is so flawed that apparently in 2014 there was a study done by the Innocence Project that showed that at least 4% of people sentenced to death are innocent in the US.
Yes.
I mean, we screw up left and right. I'm listening to an audiobook right now by Saul Kassin called Duped, and it's about false confession and how our law enforcement system frequently elicits false confessions. And then once a person has given a false confession, they're on sort of a treadmill to conviction. It's very hard to walk that back, even if the confession has been blatantly coerced. And the ways that law enforcement officers are allowed to try to get these confessions bends a lot of ethics, if you were to hear this. So I recommend this book for anybody. But I think that the system is flawed in determining who should die. And so I don't think that it's competent to decide on matters of death for people. But another thing, when we're thinking about burdening people, we think about that we can all also, just like the scenario where you imagine needing to or be put out of one's misery, right? We can also imagine a scenario where someone lingers on for a really long time in a final stage of life where their quality of life is extremely poor and the difficulty in caring for them is rather high. And so this person becomes a difficulty or a burden on loved ones or family members. And that it's interesting, like at what point would you say that scale tips? Because we are always a burden to those who love us. Some
of us more than others.
That's right. Yes. I mean, like, do you put your ex-husband out of his misery because he screwed your life up? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, we are always, we in our relationships, we always are imposing limitations on those who care for us, as well as offering them benefits and ways in which we expand their life. And so at what point does that tip? Where can we say that happens? And I think that's a very soft and squishy kind of thing. Like going back to what Melanie was saying about life, it's kind of hard to define when that happens. We kind of have a sense that we know it when we see it, but really, when is that? Is it like at 70, we just, you're probably more of a burden than you are a benefit. So it's like time to start like to stooping people off the cliff. What do we, how do we manage this? But also like the idea of death with dignity is one of the ways that this is marketed a lot. I worry about that because the implication being that you are strong and dignified if you make a choice to end your life before you burden people unduly. What does that say to the people who don't want to do that? What does that say? That starts to put shame upon the person who is willing to linger on and be sweet grandma in the bed, but she can't really do much for herself anymore. I mean, what are we saying to those people?
But like you're undignified for being vulnerable.
Yes, really. Yes. Well said.
But also what you guys were saying a minute ago, it's like, one, the woman in the coffee case in Holland who changed her mind. She's like, wait, actually, no, I don't want to do this. And you were saying, Christine, like, I feel like this way now. I don't know how I'm going to feel when actually faced with the reality of that situation. And that is a really key point because, when you're a certain way, you think, well, look at me, look at my great life. And I drive my car and I run in the park and I, go on vacations and I do cartwheels and I do yoga and blah, blah, blah. And then you think I could never live without all this stuff. But then when you're really laid low, your priorities change, your values change. You think, oh, wow, actually, now suddenly I'm grateful that the sunbeam is hitting my face. Now suddenly I'm grateful for the sound of the birds. And that is, I am so grateful that that is enough to sustain my will to live.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the most fundamental human experience. And to take that away and say, actually, no, you can't do yoga anymore, so life isn't worth living. I mean, of course, I'm being flip, but like, you know, you
Well,
don't
it's
know
like
who
the
you
coffee
are.
case. You're going to be in the home. I would have to go into a home. Well, then life isn't worth living. But then when she's faced with that, she's like, wait, no, maybe
Actually,
that's okay.
maybe it's okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is
Yeah.
literally the human spirit.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the human spirit does. It endures.
Yeah.
That's the entire point of being human.
There's
Yeah.
also another element to this where we know with, well, not even just young people, but definitely with young people, that you don't talk about suicide. The reason why we can't talk about suicide or it gets limited is because we know that it encourages other people. Like suicide is contagious, right? And so when you have, that's one argument that I don't really hear, or I haven't really heard outside, is that when we impose or when we implement medical assistance in dying or assisted suicide, is that then encouraging a whole bunch of other people who would not have otherwise even contemplated this idea to suddenly decide? Because if you look at Canada, the tenfold increase, and who knows what's happened in the last few years, I didn't check. And right. So how many of those people would have not considered it at all? I mean, I don't actually know the answer to that, but is MAID contagious?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, once you put an idea out there and it becomes something that's within the realm of acceptability, I
Then you
think,
call it a
yeah,
human
it
right.
does. That's right. That's right. No, I think that's a good point. Jenny, what you were saying earlier, I actually had that experience. I had lived with chronic pain for 2 years. And there were times when it was, at like a 25% level pain, and then times where it was really quite disabling. And this sort of meaning of my life became watching I used to lie in bed and just I had these white lace curtains against a sage green wall and then this wicker laundry basket. And it was breathtakingly beautiful. It was really, I just had moments of complete wonder.
Amazing.
So I would say to anybody who has some kind of horrible disease and you think you can't live with it, I'm not against, as I've stated, I'm not against someone choosing to die within certain circumstances. I'd say give yourself a year to see if you can live with it, because you might surprise yourself. You might find things that you would not have found without that illness.
I agree with that fully, because I also went through periods of chronic pain also that were debilitating. I had to stop working. I had to stop doing everything I loved. So there was no driving my car and going to yoga and doing all the things that I would have wanted to do or could do. Over time, I did learn how to live with it. And over time, it subsided. I found things that worked. And so I totally wholeheartedly believe in that. Give it some time and see if you can live without those things. And if you can appreciate the birds or staring at, a beautiful portrait in your living room and just actually breathing. So I completely agree with that as well.
And as horrible as physical suffering can be, psychological suffering can be just incredibly debilitating. And for people like in Canada, you were talking about the expansion, Melanie, of MAID to people with a mental illness only diagnosis. And I don't, just thinking about someone else making the decision to sign off on your suffering being too great to bear, so you qualify for something like this. I can think of times when with clients, you hear stories that are just tremendously awful. You hear about somebody's life and the way that they're telling you this story, you can feel the weight of their hopelessness and the difficulty that they've been facing. And I can think of times in my own life where I felt pinned against a wall and just boxed in and hopeless because my situation was so dark. And
Yes.
If somebody else from the outside is making that judgment, you lose sight of something I think that you were speaking to, Jenny. It's that human will to life, that sometimes we do get bogged down in this incredible way where we just don't see any ray of light But oftentimes a new day dawns or something happens or a perspective shifts in us, and suddenly the creative spirit is there, and the way to find a way emerges. And that's the case over and over again. And if we foreclose on it with suicide, then, or euthanasia, then we're cutting off that potential.
Well said.
Well, I am so grateful that you all were willing to wade into this heavy discussion. And does anybody have any final thoughts before we close out? Anything that comes up for you and as you think about this?
Next time we'll have this kind of discussion in Pig Latin so we can evade the algorithm.
Or why don't we talk about something really fun and silly next time?
I'm good with that.
Yeah, I want to talk about, did you guys see the Demi Moore movie, The Substance? It's about an aging woman who, yeah, anyway.
Is it new?
It's a horror kind of movie, but it's really interesting. Yeah, it's new. And then Deborah got the book Face by Justine Bateman, and I just ordered it, so I'm looking maybe we can talk about beauty and aging. That's
I'm
interesting.
turning 49 next in like 6 days or something, so we can definitely talk about aging there.
Happy early birthday.
Yeah. Well, thank you all again. Melanie, it's always a delight to speak with you. I'm glad you were able to join us today, and look forward to hopefully having you back with us soon.
Oh, it's lovely. Thank you for asking me to come.
I'm so glad you could.
Thanks for coming.
It was great. It was great to meet you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you in the chat for
sharing.
being here, and we'll see you guys next week. I'm going to go ahead and finish the live stream now, and if you guys want to stay on, we can chat a minute afterwards. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.